Megan and John had been together for over a decade. 12 years of marriage had seen its ups and downs, but lately, something had shifted. What had once been a relationship built on laughter and mutual trust now felt tense, with unspoken concerns hanging in the air. Their evenings, which were once spent watching their favorite shows or talking about their day, had become filled with silence and distractions. Megan would sit on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while John buried himself in his laptop, claiming he had to catch up on work. Megan had first noticed the change about 6 months ago. John's late nights had become more frequent, and his vague excuses started to feel flimsy. "It's just another meeting," he'd say, avoiding eye contact. Megan wasn't buying it anymore. She had once trusted him completely, but the doubt was creeping in, slowly taking over her thoughts. One evening, after John had texted her that he'd be home late again, Megan sat in their dimly lit living room, scrolling through old photos on her phone. She paused on a picture from their vacation 2 years ago, both of them laughing in the sun, arms around each other. She sighed, feeling the distance between them now like a physical barrier. When John finally walked in, Megan decided to probe. "You've been staying late at work a lot recently," she said casually, though her voice trembled slightly. "Everything okay?" John barely looked up as he dropped his keys on the counter. "Yeah, just a lot going on. New projects. You know how it is." Megan frowned. "You're never home before 9 anymore. What kind of projects are keeping you there so late?" John's tone shifted, defensive. "I told you, it's work. What, you don't believe me?" "That's not what I'm saying." Megan's heart raced, but she tried to keep calm. "I'm just wondering." John stared at her for a moment, then shook his head and walked away. "I'm tired, Megan. We'll talk later." But they never did. John had his own suspicions, though he hadn't voiced them yet. He had noticed the small changes in Megan over the past few months. She was dressing up more than usual, spending extra time on her hair and makeup, even when she was just running errands. And those phone calls, quick, hushed conversations that always ended as soon as he walked into the room. One afternoon, while grabbing his jacket before heading to work, he overheard her on the phone. The conversation was brief, but it left him unsettled. "Yes, I can meet you tomorrow." "No, John won't know," Megan whispered, before quickly hanging up when she saw him in the doorway. John clenched his fists, feeling the sting of betrayal, though he had no real evidence. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice a little too sharp. Megan looked startled, but quickly recovered. "Just a friend from work. Why?" "A friend?" John raised an eyebrow. "You said I wouldn't know. Why the secrecy?" Megan shrugged, but her face flushed. "It's nothing. You're being paranoid, John." "Am I?" he shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Without waiting for a response, John grabbed his car keys and stormed out the door. As he drove to work, his mind raced with the possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that Megan was hiding something from him. His thoughts spiraled as he considered whether she was having an affair. The idea consumed him, and he couldn't let it go. Neither of them knew how to confront the situation. Instead of talking it out, they both retreated further into their own corners, stewing in doubt and suspicion. That night, Megan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while John turned his back to her, scrolling through his phone. Neither said a word, both trapped in their separate worlds of fear and mistrust. Megan's thoughts swirled. What if he's really seeing someone else? All those late nights? All those excuses? She couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. She needed to know the truth. The next day, during her lunch break, Megan found herself sitting outside a private investigator's office. Her palms were sweaty as she took a deep breath and walked inside. "I need someone to follow my husband," she told the receptionist, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. At the same time, John was facing his own torment. As he sat in his office later that afternoon, his mind kept replaying the image of Megan on the phone. Was she meeting someone behind his back? Was their entire marriage a lie? Unable to bear the doubt any longer, he made a decision. After work, John stopped by a private investigator's office across town. He walked in and was greeted by a woman at the front desk. "I need to know if my wife is having an affair," he said, his voice low but firm. Both Megan and John had now taken the same step, unknowingly setting in motion a series of events that would turn their marriage and their lives upside down. Megan sat in the detective's office, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She wasn't sure what had driven her here, to this small, dimly lit room where the air smelled faintly of old leather and paperwork. But the weight of suspicion had grown too much to bear. Dan, the private investigator Megan had hired, sat across from her, his gray eyes sharp but calm. He had seen countless cases like this, couples torn apart by distrust and secrets. But Megan didn't seem like the type to be here. She looked tired, not angry, desperate, not vengeful. "So, tell me a little about what's been going on," Dan said, leaning forward with a legal pad in his hand. Megan hesitated. The words felt heavy as she began to speak. It's my husband, John. He's been working late more and more. He never used to do that. And he's distant now. He doesn't talk to me like he used to. Doesn't even look at me the same way." Dan nodded, jotting down a few notes. "Has he given you any reasons for the late nights?" "He says it's work, but I don't know. It doesn't feel right. Sometimes he's gone for hours, and when I ask, he just brushes me off. I need to know if there's someone else." Dan didn't respond immediately. He had heard this story so many times before. The slow unraveling of trust, the mind games people play with themselves when their imagination takes control. But still, he knew better than to dismiss Megan's concerns. "We'll start with the basics," Dan said finally. "I'll follow him after work, see where he goes. If there's anything suspicious, I'll know. It's all pretty standard." Megan bit her lip, feeling the weight of her decision settle in. "I just want to know the truth. I can't live like this anymore, always wondering." Meanwhile, across town, John was sitting in a different private investigator's office, unknowingly embarking on a parallel journey. Lisa, the investigator he had hired, was reviewing the information John had given her. "So, you think your wife might be cheating?" Lisa asked, glancing over her notes. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling a little out of place. He never thought he'd be here, asking someone to spy on Megan. But something had snapped in him when he overheard her hushed conversation the other day. "I don't know," John admitted. "She's been acting strange. She's on her phone a lot, she's going out more, and I overheard her talking to someone, saying I wouldn't know about a meeting. It didn't sound innocent." Lisa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms thoughtfully. "Could it be work-related? Or a friend she doesn't think you'd approve of?" "I don't think so," John said, his voice tight. "She's been dressing up more too. You don't do that for just anyone." Lisa gave a small nod. "All right, we'll start with tailing her when she leaves the house. See who she's meeting, where she's going. We'll be discreet." John exhaled slowly, feeling both relieved and sick to his stomach. "I need to know," he said, echoing Megan's words from earlier. "I just need to know what's really going on." In the days that followed, both investigators got to work, beginning their surveillance without a hitch. Dan kept a close eye on John's routine, starting at his office and following him during his late-night outings. Lisa, on the other hand, discreetly tracked Megan's movements, noting each of her errands and outings. Dan's first few days of watching John were uneventful. He followed him from his office to a local bar, where John met up with a few colleagues for drinks. Nothing seemed suspicious yet, but Dan knew better than to jump to conclusions early on. One evening, as Dan followed John out of the bar and down a quiet street, he noticed something strange. A woman was trailing behind, keeping a fair distance, but watching John closely. Dan immediately felt a prickle of suspicion. He had seen enough people tailing others to know the signs. Was she working for someone else? Could she be the other woman? Across the street, Lisa watched Dan from the shadows. She had noticed him tailing Megan earlier in the week and had begun to suspect that he might be involved in Megan's secret life. Lisa had no idea that Dan was hired by John, and Dan had no idea that Lisa was working for Megan. Both were now tailing each other without realizing the ridiculous twist that was unfolding. Later that night, Dan called Megan for an update. "I've been following John, and so far nothing seems too out of the ordinary. He met with some coworkers tonight," Dan said, his voice steady but cautious. Megan's heart sank a little. "So he's just working late?" "For now, yes, but I'll keep looking. I did notice something odd tonight, a woman following him. It might be worth investigating." "A woman?" Megan's heart raced. "Do you think she's involved with him?" "Too early to say, but I'll find out." At the same time, Lisa was sending John her own report. I've been following Megan, and she's sticking to normal routines for the most part. Errands, work. But there's a guy tailing her, and I'm looking into who he is. He seems pretty interested in her movements. A guy? John's stomach tightened. Who would be following her? That's what I'm trying to find out. Could be someone connected to whatever she's hiding, Lisa said. Don't worry, I'll get to the bottom of this. Both Megan and John went to bed that night, lying side by side, but miles apart in their thoughts. Each was convinced they were getting closer to uncovering the truth, but they had no idea that they were both chasing shadows, fueled by their own jealousy and mistrust. It was now the third week since Megan and John had each hired their private investigators, and the situation had become increasingly bizarre. Neither of them knew that their detectives had crossed paths, and now the investigation had taken on a life of its own. Dan, the seasoned investigator hired by Megan, was growing increasingly suspicious of the woman who had been tailing him during his surveillance of John. Meanwhile, Lisa, the sharp-eyed detective hired by John, was convinced that the man she had seen following Megan had something to do with her client's wife's secretive behavior. Dan watched from a distance as John walked out of his office one afternoon. John headed straight toward his car and drove off toward the city's outskirts, where he stopped at a small cafe. Dan parked a block away and kept a close eye, waiting to see if John would meet anyone. Just as Dan was about to settle in for what seemed like another dull surveillance shift, he noticed the same woman from the previous week pull up a few cars behind John. Dan frowned, his curiosity piqued. He had to know who this woman was and why she seemed so interested in John. He leaned forward in his seat, watching as she carefully got out of her car, her eyes fixed on the cafe door. Lisa had been tracking Megan for days, and though Megan's routine had seemed relatively ordinary, the man who kept appearing in the background was anything but. Lisa had spotted him more than once, and now her suspicions were growing. Today, though, something different happened. Megan wasn't the one she had followed. Instead, she had caught sight of the man tailing Megan and decided to switch gears. She was now following him, determined to figure out who he was and what role he played in Megan's life. Lisa parked her car and watched as the man sat in his vehicle, focused on the cafe. She assumed he was there to meet Megan, but after half an hour, Megan never showed. Instead, Lisa saw a different man, someone who must have been this guy's target, sitting inside the cafe, John. It didn't take her long to piece it together. The man she had been following was following John. But why? She decided it was time to confront him. Stepping out of her car, she marched toward Dan's vehicle, her hand resting on the handle of her bag, where she kept a small notebook and a camera. She tapped on the window, startling Dan, who rolled it down cautiously. "What do you think you're doing?" Lisa asked, narrowing her eyes. Dan raised an eyebrow. "I could ask you the same thing. You've been following me." Lisa crossed her arms, her stance firm. "No, I've been following you because you've been following my client's wife." Dan stared at her in disbelief for a moment. Then, it clicked. "Wait, your client is Megan? The one I've been tailing is her husband, John." Lisa blinked, taken aback. "John is your target? Megan's your client?" There was a brief moment of silence as the realization sank in for both of them. "So let me get this straight," Dan said slowly, trying to piece together the absurdity of the situation. "Your client, Megan, thinks John is cheating and she hired you to follow him?" Lisa nodded, her expression softening slightly. "And your client, John, thinks Megan is cheating and he hired you to follow her?" Dan couldn't help but laugh, though it was more out of the sheer ridiculousness of it all. Lisa shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the gravity of the situation. "This is insane," Lisa muttered. "We've been tailing each other for days." Dan rubbed his temples. "I guess the real question now is, are they both just paranoid? Or is something actually going on here?" Meanwhile, Megan was sitting at home, her nerves on edge. She had received updates from Dan, but there was still no solid proof that John was having an affair. She had expected something by now, some confirmation that she wasn't imagining things. But the longer the investigation dragged on without evidence, the more anxious she became. John was in a similar state of turmoil. Lisa had reported back that Megan's behavior was mostly normal, but she had mentioned the man who seemed to be following Megan. This only added fuel to John's suspicions. Who was this guy, and why was he tailing his wife? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making him restless and irritable. That night, Megan and John lay in bed, both staring at the ceiling, their minds racing in different directions. Megan hesitated, wondering if she should confront John about his late nights, but the fear of what she might uncover stopped her. John, on the other hand, was debating whether to ask Megan about the mysterious man Lisa had mentioned, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the question. The following day, Dan and Lisa decided to compare notes at a nearby diner, far away from where either Megan or John would go. "So, what do we do now?" Lisa asked, stirring her coffee. "It seems like neither of them is actually cheating." Dan shrugged. "Maybe, but it's also possible they're both just really good at hiding it. We've got two paranoid spouses and no solid evidence of wrongdoing." Lisa sighed. "I'll admit, I haven't found anything on Megan. Her schedule's as normal as it gets. Errands, work, the occasional lunch with friends, nothing that screams affair." "Same with John," Dan replied. "He's either at the office or out with coworkers. The guy hasn't done anything shady, but they're convinced something's going on." Lisa leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "So, what now? We keep going until we prove there's nothing? Or we try to get them to talk to each other?" Dan smirked. "What, and ruin their drama? Where's the fun in that?" They both chuckled, but the truth was they knew the case was spiraling into a strange and convoluted mess. Two people, driven by fear and insecurity, had unknowingly created a web of suspicion and surveillance, pulling their detectives into the madness. As Dan and Lisa left the diner, they agreed to stay in touch, their new partnership born out of the most absurd circumstances. Neither of them knew how this case would end, but they had a feeling it wouldn't be in the way Megan and John had expected. The stakes were growing higher, and though neither Megan nor John had uncovered the infidelity they feared, they were inching closer to a confrontation. But it wasn't the truth that would break them. It was their jealousy, their lack of trust, and their unwillingness to face the real issue head-on. The tangled mess of crossed wires was only just beginning. The absurdity of the situation had reached its boiling point. Dan and Lisa, now reluctantly teaming up, continued their investigation, each keeping their clients updated on the supposed progress. However, what had started as a serious inquiry into possible affairs had turned into a farcical game of cat and mouse. Except both cats were now following each other, completely unaware of the other's motivations. One afternoon, Dan sat parked across the street from John's office, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as he waited for John to emerge. Just as John walked out of the building, Dan noticed Lisa's car pull up a few blocks away. He groaned, half amused, half frustrated. It was time to put an end to this bizarre dance. Without thinking twice, Dan jumped out of his car and made a beeline for Lisa's. She was sitting behind the wheel, keeping a close eye on Dan. When she saw him approaching, she quickly rolled down her window. "Following me again?" Dan asked with a smirk, leaning casually against her car door. Lisa sighed. "I was just about to ask you the same thing. We've been at this for weeks, Dan." "Tell me about it." Dan shook his head, then leaned in a little closer. "Why don't we just call this whole thing off? We've both been tailing each other, and it's pretty clear by now that neither Megan nor John is actually cheating. At least, not in the way they think." Lisa crossed her arms, her eyebrows raised. "You think they're innocent? You're sure about that?" "Well, are you?" Dan shot back, grinning. "Let's face it, we've been chasing shadows. The real issue isn't some mysterious affair. It's their paranoia." Lisa stared at him for a moment, then broke into a laugh. "You're right. This is ridiculous. They've gotten so wrapped up in their own suspicions that they've basically created this whole drama out of thin air." Dan chuckled. "It's like they've been sabotaging their own marriage without even realizing it." Meanwhile, John was pacing back and forth in his office, his mind consumed by thoughts of Megan and the man following her. Lisa had mentioned him several times in her reports, and John's imagination had run wild. Was this man a lover? Someone from her past? He couldn't shake the idea that Megan was hiding something from him. Unable to take the suspense any longer, John picked up his phone and dialed Lisa. "Anything new on that guy?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Not really," Lisa replied, glancing at Dan, who was leaning against her car and making funny faces at her as she spoke. She swatted at him, rolling her eyes. He's still following Megan, but I think it's time we dig a little deeper. John's grip tightened on the phone. You think he's the one she's been seeing? What if? Hold on, John, Lisa interrupted. I think there's something you should know. It's not exactly what you think it is. Let's meet up and talk. Megan, on the other hand, was in a similar state of anxiety. She had spent the last few nights going over Dan's reports, and the mention of a woman who had been seen near John multiple times had only added fuel to her growing panic. Who was this woman? Was John seeing her behind Megan's back? The thought made her stomach churn. Unable to take it anymore, she texted Dan, asking for an urgent update. Dan, still standing by Lisa's car, saw the text and sighed. Megan's asking about your client again, he said, showing Lisa the message. Let me guess, Lisa replied, grinning. John's asking about yours. Dan nodded. We have to end this before it spirals out of control. It's getting out of hand. Later that evening, Dan and Lisa arranged for Megan and John to meet at a neutral location under the guise of providing new updates on their respective investigations. It was a cozy little restaurant downtown, far enough from their usual spots that neither spouse would suspect a setup. Dan and Lisa sat at a nearby table, watching as their clients walked in, both looking tense and confused. Megan spotted John across the room and froze. John, seeing Megan, hesitated for a moment, then quickly crossed the room toward her. What are you doing here? Megan asked, her voice full of surprise. I could ask you the same thing, John replied, narrowing his eyes. Why are you meeting someone here? I'm not meeting anyone, Megan said defensively. I thought, wait, John interrupted, his voice softening as realization dawned. Did you hire someone to follow me? Megan's face went pale. Yes. I thought you were hiding something. You've been working late, and I didn't know what to think. John shook his head in disbelief. Megan, I've been doing the same thing. I hired someone to follow you. I thought you were having an affair. Megan blinked, her mouth slightly open in shock. You? What? Just then, Dan and Lisa walked over, unable to contain themselves any longer. Lisa spoke first, smiling sheepishly. So, I think we need to clear something up. You both hired us to follow each other. Dan chuckled, stepping in. And what we found was that neither of you is cheating. You've both just been following each other's shadows. Megan and John stared at their respective detectives, speechless. The absurdity of the situation washed over them as they realized how far they'd let their insecurities and suspicions go. They had been chasing ghosts, each convinced that the other was guilty, when in reality, they had both been driving themselves, and each other, crazy. John finally broke the silence, shaking his head and laughing. I can't believe we did this. Megan, still in shock, joined in the laughter, though tears welled up in her eyes. This is ridiculous. Dan smiled, his arms crossed. Paranoia is a funny thing, isn't it? Lisa nodded in agreement. Sometimes it's not the infidelity that breaks a marriage, but the fear of it. After the initial shock had worn off, Megan and John sat down at the table, still processing everything. They both felt a strange mixture of relief and embarrassment, but the tension between them had finally begun to ease. For the first time in months, they started to talk, really talk, about their fears, their insecurities, and how they had let their imaginations get the best of them. As Dan and Lisa watched from a distance, their job was essentially over. They'd been dragged into the chaos of their clients' lives, but now that the truth was out, they could finally step back. Think they'll make it? Dan asked, watching as Megan and John began to converse in a calmer tone. Lisa shrugged, though there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I don't know, but at least they finally stopped chasing shadows. Dan smiled. Yeah, I guess that's a win. The comedic chaos had finally begun to unravel, leaving behind a mixture of relief, laughter, and a newfound sense of clarity. Megan and John had been on a wild journey of suspicion and self-doubt, but perhaps now, with the help of a little absurdity, they could start finding their way back to each other. The air between Megan and John remained tense even after the initial revelation at the restaurant. While they had shared a laugh at the ridiculousness of hiring private investigators to follow each other, the weight of their mistrust still lingered. Both were haunted by the fact that they had been so quick to assume the worst about one another. The following days were filled with uneasy silence. both of them navigating the awkwardness of knowing they had each violated the other's trust in such a drastic way. The day of their final confrontation was one they both sensed was coming, though neither could have predicted how it would unfold. Megan had been thinking about everything that had led up to this moment, replaying every missed conversation, every suspicious glance, and every unspoken worry. John, on the other hand, had been struggling with his own guilt. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, but now he had to face the fact that he had doubted Megan, and that doubt had nearly destroyed their relationship. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, the same place where they had shared so many dinners, but tonight it felt different. Neither spoke at first. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Megan stared at her glass of water, her thoughts racing. Finally, John broke the silence. "Megan, we need to talk," he said, his voice soft but serious. Megan looked up, her eyes reflecting the mixture of pain and confusion she felt. "About what? About the fact that we hired people to spy on each other because we were too afraid to just be honest?" John winced, hearing the hurt in her voice. He couldn't blame her. She was right. "I know we messed up. I know I messed up. But I think we both did this because we were scared." Megan took a deep breath. "Scared of what? I don't even know when this all started. I don't know when we stopped trusting each other." John leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "It wasn't just one thing. I think we've both been drifting apart for a while now. The late nights, the distance, it all just made us more suspicious. And instead of talking to you, I let it fester." Megan nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I did the same. I let my mind run wild. I started seeing things that weren't there. But John, you have to admit, you've been so distant lately. You've been working late, coming home after dark, and not telling me anything." John sighed, running his hands through his hair. I know I haven't been around as much, but it wasn't because of someone else. Work's been stressful, and I didn't want to burden you with it." Megan shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But you did burden me, John. Not by talking about work, but by keeping me in the dark. I felt like I wasn't a part of your life anymore." There was a long pause. John stared at the floor, guilt tightening in his chest. He hadn't realized how much his behavior had hurt her. He thought he was protecting her by keeping things to himself, but in reality, he had pushed her away. "I'm sorry," John finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything. For not being there, for making you feel like I didn't trust you. And I'm sorry for hiring someone to follow you. That was wrong." Megan looked at him, her heart aching with the mix of emotions she had been carrying for weeks. "I'm sorry too," she whispered, wiping away another tear. "I should have just talked to you. Instead, I let my insecurities take over. But John, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep avoiding the real problems." John nodded, the truth of her words hitting him hard. "I know. I don't want to live like this anymore, constantly wondering, doubting. We've both been so afraid of losing each other that we've created this mess." Megan sniffled, her voice shaking. "It's like we've been sabotaging our own marriage." John reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "I don't want to lose you, Megan. I love you. I've always loved you. But we can't keep going like this. We need to rebuild what we've lost." Megan squeezed his hand, feeling the sincerity in his words. "I love you too, John. But you're right. This has to stop. We need to start being honest with each other, completely honest. No more secrets. No more hiding." Their conversation continued late into the night, both of them laying bare their fears, their mistakes, and their hopes for the future. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, but for the first time in months, they were finally talking. Really talking. They spoke about the distance that had crept into their marriage, the small moments of disconnect that had grown into gaping chasms of suspicion. They acknowledged the role they had both played in letting those doubts fester. It wasn't an immediate solution. They knew that rebuilding trust would take time. But the fact that they were sitting together, being open and vulnerable, was a step in the right direction. For the first time in a long while, they felt like partners again, facing the future together instead of letting their fears tear them apart. Before they went to bed, Megan spoke one last time, her voice soft but determined. "We can't pretend this didn't happen," she said, looking at John. We almost lost each other because of our own insecurities. But I don't want to lose you. Not like this. John nodded, wrapping his arms around her as they stood by the bedroom door. Neither do I. We'll get through this, Megan. We'll figure it out. And for the first time in months, they held each other, not out of fear or desperation, but out of the desire to heal. There were still challenges ahead, but at least now they were facing them together, no longer hiding in the shadows of their own suspicions. As they fell asleep, Megan whispered into the quiet of the night, "We'll be okay, won't we?" John kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer. We will be. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the realization that love could survive, even when trust had been broken. They were both willing to fight for their marriage, to rebuild what they had lost, and to start over with honesty and transparency. It wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. The days after the confrontation felt different for Megan and John. There was a lingering tension, but it was no longer fueled by suspicion. Instead, it came from the awareness that they had been closer to destroying their marriage than they had realized. The betrayal wasn't one of infidelity. It was something much deeper and more personal. Both of them had betrayed each other's trust, not through physical acts, but through doubt, jealousy, and the refusal to communicate. The real betrayal had come from within. Megan stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom one morning, running her fingers through her hair as she stared at her reflection. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained by everything that had happened. The weight of the past few weeks had left her feeling fragile, and as she looked into her own eyes, she felt a deep sadness settle in. It wasn't about John's late nights or her own paranoia anymore. It was about the cracks that had formed in their relationship long before the investigators entered the picture. John walked into the room, glancing at her reflection in the mirror before he quietly sat on the edge of the bed. There was a heaviness between them now, a shared understanding that they had almost lost something precious. "I've been thinking," Megan said, breaking the silence as she turned to face him. "It wasn't just about the detectives, or even about us thinking the other was cheating. It's everything we let build up over the years, all the little things we didn't talk about." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You're right. We've been letting things go for a long time. And I think I started pulling away because I didn't know how to handle it." Megan sat beside him, her voice soft. "You were avoiding me, John. I felt it, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. And instead of talking to you, I just assumed the worst." John looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I wasn't avoiding you because of someone else. I was avoiding you because I didn't want to face how disconnected we'd become. I thought maybe if I just focused on work, it would, I don't know, fix itself. But I was wrong." Megan sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "We were both wrong. We let our insecurities push us apart. I started thinking that you didn't want me anymore, that you were looking for something or someone else." John reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "I never stopped wanting you, Megan. But I didn't know how to show you that. I was so caught up in my own fears that I didn't realize how much I was hurting you." Megan felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't just sadness, it was a release of the tension that had been building for months. "And I hurt you too. I let myself believe that you were unfaithful, and that was my betrayal. I didn't trust you." John squeezed her hand, his voice soft. "We both betrayed each other, just in different ways." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands still intertwined. The quiet felt different now, more open, as though they were finally starting to see each other clearly again. Over the next few weeks, Megan and John worked on rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy. Trust was something that would take time to regain, and there were moments when they both struggled with the remnants of doubt. But they had promised each other that they would be honest, even when it was difficult. One evening, they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the world outside felt calm, even if their emotions were still in the process of healing. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Megan said, breaking the peaceful silence. "About how we both assumed the worst about each other, and how easy it was to let fear take over." John looked at her, his expression serious but open. It was like we were both trying to protect ourselves from getting hurt, but in the process, we hurt each other more than we ever could have imagined. Megan nodded. Exactly. And I think what scared me the most wasn't that you might have been seeing someone else. It was the idea that we had become so disconnected that it felt like a real possibility. That's what terrified me. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. I get it. I felt the same way. When I overheard you on the phone, my mind went straight to the worst-case scenario. I didn't even give you the benefit of the doubt. Megan smiled sadly. We forgot how to trust each other. And without trust, everything else started to fall apart. John turned to face her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. I don't want to live like that anymore, Megan. I don't want us to keep second-guessing each other or doubting every little thing. I want us to trust each other again. Completely. Megan looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and apprehension. I want that too, John. But it's going to take time. We can't just pretend like everything's fine. John nodded. I know, and I'm willing to put in the work. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. Megan took a deep breath, feeling the sincerity in his words. So am I. As the days turned into weeks, Megan and John slowly began to rebuild their trust. It wasn't a smooth process. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old insecurities tried to resurface. But they had made a pact to communicate openly, to talk about their fears, instead of letting them fester. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. One night, as they sat together in the living room, John turned to Megan, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said quietly, I've realized that the real betrayal wasn't about thinking we were cheating on each other. It was about how we stopped trusting each other, how we let fear and doubt take over instead of talking. Megan nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Yeah, we didn't cheat physically, but we betrayed each other emotionally by assuming the worst. That's what hurt the most. John reached out and took her hand, his voice steady. But we're fixing it. We're doing what we should have done from the start, talking, listening, and trusting again. Megan smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. We're getting there. Slowly, but we're getting there. As they sat together, hand in hand, Megan and John knew they still had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long while, they felt like they were on the right path. The emotional wounds were still healing, but they were healing together, and that was what mattered most. They had faced a different kind of betrayal, not one of infidelity, but of mistrust and fear. And now, they were learning how to rebuild their relationship, not just as husband and wife, but as partners who were finally learning to trust each other again.